140 years ago on this very day, a bunch of European delegates met up to speak about Africa in Berlin, with no Africans present in the room. Matter of fact, only 2 of these men had ever been on the African continent, but that didn't matter. These men had a job to do and not 1 second to lose. So under a gigantic map of Africa, they got to dividing a continent amongst themselves. A continent that, it should be mentioned, wasn't their own. Yes, for the next 100-some days, Africa would be partitioned and handed out like a piece of pie amongst 13 European nations and the US. But why exactly did all of this happen? Well, to answer that, I've got to tell you about the 1884 Berlin Conference, or what the Lagos Observer called at the time the world's biggest robbery. The Berlin Conference, also known as the West Africa Conference or the Congo Conference, was a get-together of Western powers in which they discussed ways to amicably divide Africa's resources. You'll understand soon enough, however, that while amicable for them, this meeting was held at the expense of, well, Africans. Although hailed as the greatest international gathering of its kind at the time, there was nothing really international about it, given that African representatives were neither present nor allowed. Scandalous, I know, but the reason for that lies in what happened before the Berlin Conference. The road to Berlin was a long one, and what happened at that 1884 conference was really the culmination of a bunch of things that, all had to do with European interference on the African continent. If we were to get into the minutiae of European exploration from the 15th to 18th century in Africa, we'd be here a while, so I'll be boiling all of that down to some key points that I think are important for this particular video. Okay, so while European exploration of the African continent began in the 15th century, it was very limited, and it stayed limited well into the 17th and 18th centuries. See, the slave trade only required coastal bases, and so apart from some territories that were concentrated near different coasts, the interior of Africa remained quite literally unknown to Europeans until the late 19th century. In fact, up till the 1870s, most of Africa remained under traditional and local control, what with Europeans controlling only about 10% of the African continent. Still weird to say that folks from one continent controlled parts of another, but keep that percentage and date I just mentioned in mind because it's gonna come up later. So although much of the continent hadn't been colonized by the 19th century, that's not to say that European presence hadn't destabilized African societies up to that point. Matter of fact, it very deliberately brought about structural and political instability. Strong African states were no good to Europeans. To preserve their interests, they needed to destabilize African societies, and well, that's what they did. The Industrial Revolution, as well as medical advances against tropical diseases, also facilitated European expansion inland, and the discovery of precious minerals in African soil only ramped up outside interest. So, as Europeans moved further and further into the interior of Africa, claiming bigger and bigger chunks of land along the way, they interfered in African affairs, altered local landscapes, and created power vacuums that they were then, of course, compelled to fill in the interest of commerce, civilization, and Christianity. Africa was ripe for the taking, and Europeans scrambled to claim a part of her. This, in turn, destroyed the authority of African rulers and undermined their rule so much that by the 1870s, Europeans felt that they had nothing to fear from them. Different European countries started vying over control of the interior of Africa, and this not only led to conflicts from resisting indigenous populations, but also between different imperial powers. For example, a big point of contention between Belgium, France, Portugal, and Britain was the Congo Basin in Central Africa. All of those colonial powers wanted control of the area, and Belgian King Leopold II's secret exploration of it only added to the hostilities. I talk all about Leopold II's reign of terror and the Congo in this video, so I won't get into detail here. What's important to note for this particular video is that growing European interference in Central Africa led to territorial disputes. Due to a collapse of a bunch of treaties, Portugal became convinced that other European countries were trying to squeeze it out of Central Africa. And so it called up its buddy, Germany, and asked it to organize a conference for all of them to sort it out. Germany was more than happy to jump on the occasion because not only was it looking to establish itself as an African powerhouse, it was also sick of all the infighting. I mean, all this scramble for Africa had done was threaten European peace and stability, and if nothing was done to check the situation, who knows what would happen to the European balance of power? And thus the idea of a summit that could promote cooperation and mutual trade for the benefit of all colonial powers won approval. They effectively said, guys, let's stop ganging up on each other. This is ridiculous. We need to come together, join forces, and gang up on this guy. So in 1884, on a cold Saturday afternoon, representatives from the US, the Ottoman Empire, and every European country except Switzerland gathered at the home of German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck for the Berlin Conference. The Berlin Conference effectively formalized the scramble for Africa and regulated colonial activity. More importantly, however, the Berlin Conference was, quote, the concrete manifestation of the beast of economic imperialism. Behind their talks of humanitarianism, these European powers had but one goal: lining their pockets. If the bloody conquest of Africa both before and after 1884 didn't prove that, then the fact that the major talking points of the conference were all centered around trade certainly did. The conference was, as journalist Daniel de Leon described it, diplomatic in form and economic in fact. From November 15, 1884 to February 26, 1885, US and European representatives partitioned Africa along colonial lines with no regard to existing cultural borders. And no African was at that table because their opinion wasn't considered necessary. Matter of fact, Mr. Bismarck stated in his opening remarks that they weren't there or gathered to discuss matters of African sovereignty. And when the Sultan of Zanzibar tried getting himself invited to the conference, he was practically laughed off by the British. As an editor of a Lagos newspaper said in 1891, a forcible possession of our land has taken the place of a forcible possession of our person. The Berlin Act that all those Western countries signed effectively denied sovereignty to African states. Oh, and here are those countries. Let me know if you see one of yours. Sorry in advance if you do. Colonial powers knew that Africa wasn't uninhabited, but they believed that the indigenous populations couldn't rule themselves. Which is probably why, when facing pushback and backlash regarding the conference, they implied that Africans were, in fact, responsible for their own conquest. As in, if they could govern themselves, well, colonialists wouldn't need to come over and colonize. Really, the Berlin Act helped establish on paper imperialist thought, which was that Africa could be occupied by whichever person could take it. So remember how I said that in the 1870s, Europeans controlled only 10% of the continent? Well, at the beginning of the 20th century, 90% of Africa was under European control, with only Liberia and Ethiopia remaining independent. Europeans carved up a continent of over 30 million square kilometers in under a generation, and boy oh boy, did they collect the spoils. And what's worse is that the blatant disregard of ethnic or political boundaries that had been established by indigenous African populations continues to generate conflict today. See, Europeans had to sort Africans into units they could control, and so they lumped together groups that spoke different languages, practiced different religions, and had different cultures. Then they invented age-old African traditions and pointed to them as a way of justifying various laws. But as you can imagine, this generated conflict because, again, these groups had nothing in common. And colonial administrations couldn't give a hoot because African tribes fighting amongst themselves meant that they were fighting colonialism, and thus tribalism was allowed to proliferate and continues to be the bane of African politics. As former Tanzanian President Julius Nyerere said, "We have artificial nations carved out at the Berlin Conference in 1884, and today we are struggling to build these nations into stable units of human society." Not to mention that the callous manner in which the Berlin Conference dealt with the question of the African continent paved the way for how Africa's treated today. Africa is still seen as a battleground for raw materials, an arena for various outside actors to compete over. And it's worth noting that, just like in the days of old, conferences that center around Africa are rarely held on the continent itself. Ultimately, the Berlin Conference was Africa's undoing in more ways than one, but there is hope that moving forward, African nationalism will triumph over the legacy of the Berlin Act and usher in a new, more unified era on the continent.